I know the exact moment my mother stopped being a person to Della and became an inconvenience. It was a Tuesday in October, 4 years ago, and I was pulling into my father's driveway when I saw the smoke. Not a lot of it, just a thin gray thread rising from the back of the yard where the old fire pit sat on its cracked concrete pad. My father had used that pit maybe 3 times in 20 years. My mother had hated it. She said the smell of wood smoke got into everything, into the curtains, the dog's fur, her good wool sweaters, and she could never fully get it out. I remember sitting in my car for a moment, the engine still running. I remember the smell of the October salt air coming through the cracked window, the way the sky over the harbor had gone that particular shade of pewter it gets in New England just before the cold truly sets in. I remember thinking, who is burning something? And then I walked around the side of the house, and I saw what it was. Della was standing at the fire pit with a cardboard box at her feet and a long metal fireplace poker in her right hand. She was dressed in her usual weekend outfit, pressed slacks, a cream-colored turtleneck, her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head the way she always wore them when she thought she was being efficient. In the fire, there were papers, bundles of them, tied in rubber bands that had already melted into black threads. Some of the papers were already ash, some were still catching, their edges going orange and then brown and then nothing. I recognized the handwriting on the nearest bundle before the flames reached it. My mother had very particular handwriting. Everyone who knew her said so. She formed her letters with this slight leftward slant, very precise, the kind of penmanship they stopped teaching in school sometime in the late 70s. She had learned it from her own mother. She had tried to teach it to me when I was small, sitting at the kitchen table with the lined practice paper and the fat pencil, her hand over mine. I never got it right, but I always recognized it. That was my mother's handwriting. Burning. I said, "What are you doing?" Della looked up. She didn't flinch. That was the thing about Della. She never flinched. She had this quality of complete unruffledness, like she had already anticipated every possible objection to everything she did and found them all wanting. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has asked you why you're washing dishes. "Clearing out the study," she said. "It's been 4 years, Nora. Your father has been saying he wants to use that room." "Those are my mother's letters." "They're paper," Della said. She nudged the box with her toe. "There must be 17 years worth in here. It's not healthy. It's not good for your father to be surrounded by—" "Those are her letters," I said again. And Della looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. And she said, "They're clutter, sweetheart. Just clutter." My father came out of the back door about 30 seconds later with 2 cups of coffee. He looked at the fire. He looked at me. He looked at Della. And he didn't say anything. He just handed Della her cup. I stood there for another minute. I couldn't move. The smoke was thin and acrid now. Not the clean smell of wood smoke, but the chemical smell of rubber bands and aged paper and whatever invisible residue accumulates on letters that have been handled, reread, pressed back into envelopes for 17 years. The smell of my mother being unmade. My father looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup. His expression was, I want to describe it accurately. It was not unkind. It was not cruel. It was the expression of a man who has made a decision and has decided not to revisit it, and who hopes, very quietly, that you won't make him. It was the expression he had been wearing for the last 3 years of his marriage to Della, more and more often, in more and more situations. I turned around and I walked back to my car. I did not say goodbye. I pulled out of the driveway, and at the end of the street I had to stop for a moment, because my hands were doing something strange. Not shaking exactly, but vibrating, the way a tuning fork vibrates when you strike it. A very fine, controlled, internal frequency. I put both hands flat on the steering wheel, and I breathed 4 times, slowly, through my nose. Then I drove home. I need to tell you something about Della, because she deserves to be understood, even now, especially now. Della Foss grew up in a town 20 miles north of here, inland, no water, the kind of town where the main industry left in 1987, and the community has been quietly grieving ever since. She was one of 5 children. Her parents rented. She put herself through a 2-year business degree at the community college and spent the next 20 years working as an office manager at a medical practice that paid her $38,000 a year and gave her a parking spot and a key to the supply closet. She was careful with money because she'd had to be. She was organized because disorder had cost her things in the past. She was efficient because efficiency had been, for most of her adult life, the only tool she had. When she married my father, she came into a house she had never owned anything like, a cedar house on the water, a bedroom with a view of the harbor. Summer mornings when the light came in through the salt-hazed windows and lay in long white bands across the hardwood floors. She had worked very hard for 20 years, and this was the closest she had ever come to the life she thought work was supposed to eventually produce. I am not saying she was right to want it. I am not saying she was right in how she tried to keep it. I am saying that I understand the arithmetic of her desperation. I am saying that a woman who spent her childhood watching others have things she couldn't, and then spent her middle age in the company of a house she could not legally claim, might do things that a woman with more security would not do. I'm not forgiving her. I'm explaining her, because she's a person, and people are always more than the worst thing they've done. But here is what she did. In the 6 months before my father died, when his blood pressure had become concerning enough that his cardiologist had used the word stroke in a context that was not hypothetical, Della had begun, quietly, to move. I didn't know this at the time. I learned it later, in pieces, from documents and from my father's old friend Curtis, and from one very illuminating conversation with the paralegal at Della's attorney's office, who had apparently decided, upon reflection, that her professional obligations did not extend to concealing what she had observed. Della had consulted an estate attorney. She had asked, specifically, about spousal rights under Maine law in the event that her husband died intestate or in the event that his will predated their marriage. She had been told that in the absence of a more recent instrument, a surviving spouse had significant protections. She had been told that the 1997 will, which she had found a copy of in my father's files and photographed without his knowledge, would likely govern, and would leave the estate in a form that gave her, as his surviving spouse, a strong claim. She did not tell my father she had done this. She burned my mother's letters in October. My father died in April. In the 7 months between those 2 events, Della was very kind to him. Curtis told me that. He said Owen seemed happy in that last winter, that Della cooked the things he liked, that she was attentive, that she drove him to his appointments. Curtis said he thought everything was fine. I think Della had decided to be patient. I think she had looked at the numbers and made her plan and decided that the best thing she could do was wait and be present and let time do what time does. and she might have gotten away with it. I stood there and I watched the rest of my mother burn, and I told myself to remember this moment because I had a feeling, even then, even before I knew what I know now, that this moment was going to matter. I was right. My name is Nora Aldrich. I'm 32 years old. I've worked as a paralegal at the Castlemore County Probate Office for the last 7 years, which means I spend my days in the company of other people's dead. Wills, codicils, letters testamentary. I know what a valid legal instrument looks like. I know what a forged signature looks like. I know what happens when someone dies without their paperwork in order, and I know what happens when someone dies with it in perfect order, and the people left behind simply decide to pretend otherwise. My mother, May Aldrich, died 19 years ago. Ovarian cancer, stage 4, diagnosed when I was 13 and gone 9 months later. She was 41 years old. I have not, in the 19 years since, spent a single day not thinking about her. My father, Owen, married Della 3 years after my mother died. I was 16. Della was a perfectly adequate stepmother in the way that a beige wall is a perfectly adequate wall, functional, inoffensive, and utterly without warmth. She cooked dinner, she kept the house, she tolerated me with a civility that I recognized even at 16 as something close to effort. We were not close. We were never going to be close. What I did not know, for a very long time, was what Della actually wanted. My mother's family had owned property in this part of coastal Maine for 4 generations. A cedar shingled house on the water, which is where I grew up. A small investment account that my grandmother had started with careful post-war savings, and my mother had grown through decades of quiet, disciplined attention. Not a fortune, by any standard, but not nothing. The house alone, in today's market, appraises at $1.4 million. The investment account, as of last spring, sits at $618,000. My mother's will, written in 1997, 2 years before she was diagnosed, left everything to my father. That is the will Della knows about. There is another document, and this is where I need to tell you about the letter. My mother knew she was dying from almost the moment of diagnosis. The doctors were careful and kind, but she had read enough to understand the odds, and she was a woman who faced things directly, who always had been. In those 9 months, she did a great deal. She organized her affairs, she labeled photographs, she wrote letters to friends, to cousins, to her sister in Vermont. She wrote letters to me for every birthday and milestone she thought she would miss. My high school graduation, my first heartbreak, my wedding someday if it came. And she did one more thing. She called an attorney. Not the family attorney, a different one. A woman named Margot Pelletier, who had an office in a small building on Harbor Street and who had been a friend of my grandmother's. My mother went to see her twice, alone, while my father was at work. I know this because Margot told me so 19 years later when I finally came to her office. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what I found first. 3 weeks after the bonfire, after watching Della reduce 17 years of my mother's words to ash and calling them clutter, I went to my own apartment and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The apartment smells of the old wood floors and the salt that comes off the harbor, and I had made myself a cup of the strong black tea my mother used to make, the kind with the red label that I buy at the same shop on Water Street she always used, and I held the mug with both hands and I thought. I thought about what I remembered. When my mother was dying, when it became clear that she would not recover, she sat with me one afternoon in her bedroom, on the white chenille bedspread with the window light coming in gold and late across the floor. She was thin by then. Her hands were very light in mine. She said, "There's something I need you to keep for me. Not your father, not anyone else, just you." She gave me an envelope. It was sealed. It was addressed in her handwriting to no one, just a blank face. She said, "I want you to put this somewhere safe, somewhere that isn't this house." She said, "When you're old enough to understand what's in it, you'll know what to do." I was 13 years old. I took the envelope to the Castlemore Savings Bank on Harbor Street, which is where I had my small savings account, the account my grandmother had opened for me with a $12 initial deposit when I was born. I did not have a safety deposit box. I did not know how to get one. I went to the teller on duty, an older woman with a silver bun and reading glasses on a chain, whose name I did not know then. And I told her that my mother was dying and that I had something I needed to keep safe. I will be grateful until I die for what that woman did. She looked at me, this 13-year-old girl with red eyes and shaking hands, and she said, "Let's get you set up." She waived the annual fee. She put the box in my name only. She walked me through the paperwork herself, and she handed me the only key with a gravity and a gentleness that I have never forgotten. I put the envelope in the box. I did not open it for 19 years. This is not because I forgot. I never forgot. It is because my mother told me that when I was old enough to understand, I would know. And for a long time, I didn't think I understood yet. For a long time, the locked box at Castlemore Savings was the last private thing I had from her, and opening it felt like the end of something. I was afraid of that ending. But then I watched Della burn her letters, and I thought, if my mother went to the trouble of hiding something from everyone except me, at the end of her life, when she was too sick and tired to waste a single breath on anything that didn't matter, then it mattered. I drove to Castlemore Savings the next morning. The branch looks the same as it did 19 years ago, which is something I have always found comforting about small towns. The floors are the original black and white tile. The teller windows have the same brass bars. The woman at the desk who handles box access, and here I recognized her immediately, the silver bun now fully white, the reading glasses still on the same thin chain, looked up when I gave my name and the box number. "Nora Aldrich," she said. "You remember me," I said. "I remember everyone," she said. Her name, I would learn, was Ruth. She walked me back to the vault room herself. My hands were not shaking when I opened the box, which surprised me. I had expected them to shake. Instead, I felt a kind of preternatural calm. The same calm I feel in court when I know the documents are in order and the argument is airtight. The kind of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of certainty. The envelope was there. 19 years in a metal box had not changed it much. The paper had yellowed slightly at the corners. My mother's handwriting was still clear. I opened it at the small table in the vault room with Ruth standing by the door because I asked her to stay, because I needed a witness, because even then, before I knew what was in the document, some professional instinct in me understood that this moment needed to be witnessed. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten in my mother's leftward slanting script, and folded behind the letter, on separate paper, was a legal document, a codicil to her will. Dated March 14th, 2001, 8 months before she died. Witnessed by 2 signatures I did not recognize, and notarized with the seal of a notary public in Castlemore County. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Ruth and I said, "I need you to stay right there And I need you to understand that you have just witnessed me opening this box and finding this document, and I need you to remember this date and time." Ruth looked at me over her reading glasses. She said, "Honey, I've been remembering things in this bank for 37 years. I'm not about to stop now." Here is what my mother's codicil said. She had amended her 1997 will to specify that the family property, the cedar house on the water, the investment accounts, all real property and financial assets derived from her family's line, would pass to me, Nora May Aldrich, her daughter, outright upon the death of my father. Further, in the event of remarriage, no subsequent spouse of Owen Aldrich would acquire any claim, ownership interest, right of survivorship, or marital interest in the listed properties, regardless of length of marriage or any other instruments. My mother had, from her deathbed, anticipated Della. Not Della specifically. She couldn't have known Della would exist. But she had known my father. She had loved him, I believe, genuinely and completely. And she had known that he was the kind of man who needed someone, who would seek someone, who might find someone who was not who he thought she was. She had known that her family's property, 4 generations of it, her grandmother's savings, her parents' house, might slip away through the ordinary legal mechanism of remarriage and community property. And so she had closed that door. 18 months after Owen Aldrich died, her codicil would govern. My father died 14 months ago. A stroke. He was 67. He had not been sick, or rather, he had been the kind of sick that doesn't announce itself. High blood pressure managed with medication, a stress level he always described as fine in a tone that told you it was not fine. He died on a Wednesday morning in April while he was eating breakfast. He was alone. Della had already left for her book club. I had been expecting a call from the family attorney. I had been expecting the 1997 will to be entered into probate, the will that left everything to my father, which after his death, absent any other instrument, would pass through the marital estate in a way that would give Della significant claims on the property. I had been expecting to lose my mother's house. What I had not done was file the codicil. I need to stop for a moment and explain something to you, because this is the part where you might wonder what I was waiting for. Why a woman who works in probate law, who knows exactly what a notarized codicil means, who had been holding this document for 3 weeks by the time her father died, had not yet filed it. The answer is that I was going to. I had an appointment scheduled with Margot Pelletier, the original drafting attorney, still practicing, still in her office on Harbor Street, for the week after my father died. I had the document in my bag. I had the plan. And then Della called me on a Thursday, 9 days after my father's funeral, at 7:14 in the evening, and told me that she had already retained her own attorney and was proceeding to file the 1997 will in probate, and that she expected the estate to be settled within 90 days, and that she hoped we could handle this as a family. As a family. I remember where I was when she said that. I was standing in my kitchen, holding the handle of the refrigerator door, which I had opened and then not closed because the call came in. There was cold air on my ankles. I could smell the remains of the chicken soup I'd made 2 days earlier. Outside the window, the harbor lights were just coming on, and the water was flat and black. And I stood there in the cold air, thinking about a woman who had burned my mother's letters in a backyard fire pit and then called me family. I said, "I'll be in touch, Della," and I hung up. I called Margot Pelletier that night. Her office was exactly as I had imagined it. The same old building, which had once been a ship chandler's warehouse in a previous life, with the original brick walls and the smell of old paper that I have always found comforting because it smells like certainty, like things that have been written down and cannot be unwritten. Margot was in her late 60s, small and precise, with white hair she wore pinned close to her head. She shook my hand and she said, "I was wondering when you'd come." And I had to sit down. She had known my mother well. She told me things about her that I didn't know, that my mother had come to her twice, both times on her lunch break, both times clear-eyed and methodical in the way of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and why. That my mother had specifically said, "I don't want Owen to know about this. He'll try to talk me out of it, and I'm not wrong, and I don't have the energy to prove it to him right now." That my mother had said, "My daughter will come eventually. She'll know what to do." I cried in Margot's office, which I had not done since the funeral. I cried in a way that felt like something being released rather than something breaking. The difference between a knot being untied and a rope being cut. Margot handed me a box of tissues and waited with the patience of someone who had been present at a great many moments of human grief and had learned that the right thing to do was wait. Then she said, "So, let's talk about what we do next. Welcome back to Dark Road Revenge, where the people you trusted with your family's whole story sometimes do their best work in the dark, when they think no one else is reading. If you're new here, hit subscribe and come with us, because we are just getting to the part of this story where things stop being sad and start being something else entirely. Here is what I need you to understand about probate law, because it matters. When someone dies, their estate enters a court process called probate, during which their will is validated and their assets are distributed. In the state of Maine, there is a filing window, a period during which any interested party can submit a competing instrument, a codicil, a challenge. That window is not infinite. Della's attorney had filed the 1997 will on a Monday. The competing instrument window, under Maine Probate Code, was 60 days from the date of that filing. That gave me 51 days. Margot filed the codicil on a Tuesday morning. She filed it with the notarized original, with the chain of custody documentation, my statement, Ruth's statement, the bank's records showing the box had been opened for the first time in 19 years the previous month, and with her own notarized affidavit confirming that she had drafted the document at my mother's direction in March of 2001, that she retained the original drafting records in her files, and that the document was, in her professional opinion, fully valid. I walked out of that courthouse on a Tuesday in November at 11:22 in the morning, and I stood on the courthouse steps in the cold salt air, and I breathed. The next 7 weeks were not quiet. I want to be honest about that. Della retained an additional attorney, a firm out of Portland that specialized in will contests, which told me she was taking this seriously, which told me she had more to lose than she had let on. There were challenges to the codicil's validity, arguments about the witnessing, about my mother's mental capacity at the time of signing, about whether the document had been properly recorded. These are all standard challenges. I know them all. I have processed the paperwork on estates where these challenges succeeded and on estates where they failed. The mental capacity argument was the one that made me the angriest. I want to name that because I try to be accurate about my own feelings, and that one made my teeth ache. To argue that my mother, a woman who was lucid and methodical and precise until the last weeks of her life, who organized her photographs and wrote birthday letters for the next 10 years, and went alone to an attorney's office and executed a legal document without anyone holding her hand, was not of sound mind. to reduce her to a category of diminishment that justified ignoring what she'd decided. I sat with that anger. I let it be what it was, and then I went back to work. Margot filed a response. She filed it with 3 things. The first was a letter from my mother's oncologist. The records had been retained, as medical records are, describing her cognitive status at the time of the codicil signing as fully intact, alert, and oriented, with no evidence of impaired judgment. The second was a statement from the 2 witnesses. They were not difficult to find. The woman who had worked with my mother at the library was 71 now, still in town, still sharp. Her husband, the retired county clerk, was 74. They both remembered the signing. The county clerk said, with the specific economy of a man who has spent his life in the company of legal records, May Aldrich was one of the clearest-minded people I have ever met. She knew exactly what she was signing, and exactly why. The third was the original drafting notes from Margot's files, the handwritten session notes from both meetings, with dates and times recording my mother's specific instructions, her questions, her amendments, and her final approval. Notes kept in Margot's own hand in a filing cabinet that had sat in her office on Harbor Street for 23 years undisturbed. Della's attorney filed 2 more motions after that. One challenged the chain of custody of the document, arguing that 19 years in a safety deposit box with no court-recorded provenance was insufficient. Margot filed Ruth's 37-year employment record at Castlemore Savings and the bank's own vault access logs, which showed my name and only my name on every access record since the box was opened. The motion was denied. The second motion argued that my mother had not properly notified my father of the codicil's existence, and that this constituted a procedural defect. This is not, in fact, a requirement under Maine law. Margot explained this to the court in 3 paragraphs. The motion was denied. I went to the courthouse for the final ruling. I sat in the gallery in the hard wooden chair that smells of old varnish, in the room with the high windows where the November light came in thin and gray, and I listened to the judge read the ruling in the measured, unhurried cadence that the law uses when it has made up its mind. Margot sat at the table. Della's attorney sat at the other table. Della was not there. I had half expected her to be. She was not. The codicil was valid. My mother's wish was honored. On a Thursday in January, 43 days after Margot filed the codicil, the Castlemore County Probate Court issued its ruling. The codicil was valid. My mother's wish was honored. The Cedar House on the water and the investment account with its $618,000 passed to me outright. Della retained her own personal assets, her car, her savings, her retirement accounts accumulated in her own name over 22 years of marriage. What she did not retain was any claim on my mother's property. Not the house, not the land, not the water view she had been sleeping beside for 2 decades. I did not feel triumphant when I read the ruling. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be easy, and perhaps satisfying to imagine, that there was a moment of soaring victory. There wasn't. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. Something like the feeling of a long-carried weight being set down, not triumphantly, but simply, the way you set down a heavy bag in your own front hall when you finally come home. I thought about my mother in that moment, about the particular quality of intelligence and foresight it would have taken to do what she had done, to look past her own grief and her own dying and her own fear for my father, and to say, quietly, to herself, "I will not let this be undone. I will not let my daughter lose what 4 generations of my family built because I have chosen to love someone, and because loving someone cannot always protect you from what that person might someday choose. She could not have known Della's name. She knew Della anyway. My father. I need to say something about my father. I have spent a great deal of time thinking about Owen Aldridge since his death. He was a quiet man, steady. He loved my mother the way some people love things they know are beyond their full understanding, with a reverence that coexisted with a kind of helplessness. When she died, something in him receded. I could see it happen. A room closed in him that I don't think ever fully reopened. Della gave him companionship. She gave him structure. She gave him a reason to eat dinner at a table instead of a counter. I do not think he loved her the way he loved my mother. I do not think he knew what she wanted from the property until, perhaps, near the end, when small things began to clarify. After the ruling, my father's old friend, a man named Curtis, who had been at the funeral and who called me once a week in the months after, told me something my father had said to him about 2 months before his death. He'd said, "I think I made a mistake, Curtis. I think May knew something I didn't." He never told me. I don't know if he didn't have the chance, or if he was ashamed, or if he simply couldn't find the words for it. I've made peace with not knowing. What I know is this. My mother found the words. She found them, and she wrote them down, and she sealed them, and she gave them to a 13-year-old girl and trusted her to carry them, unread, until the time was right. She trusted me before I knew how to be trusted. I want to tell you about Ruth. The day after the probate ruling came through, I went back to Castlemore Savings Bank, not for any legal purpose, just to go. Ruth was at her desk. She still works there 3 days a week, which she calls keeping my hand in. And I put a small wrapped package on her desk, and I said, "This is for you." Inside was a pair of wool gloves from the shop on Water Street where my mother used to buy all her cold weather things. Not expensive, soft, well made, in the particular shade of dark green my mother had always liked. Ruth had mentioned once, in the vault room on the morning I'd opened the box, that her hands were always cold in winter and that she'd lost her good gloves somewhere last fall. She opened the box and she looked at the gloves and she looked at me. "How did it go?" she said. "It went the way it was supposed to go," I said. Ruth put the gloves on right there at her desk, flexed her fingers and said, "Good." I have the cedar house now. It is mine, not in the sense of a thing I have acquired, but in the sense of a thing that was always meant to be, that was always waiting, that my mother looked forward from her deathbed and willed into my hands 19 years before I was old enough to receive it. I am living in it now, and I have done one small thing to mark it as mine, as hers, as the continuation of something that no fire and no legal challenge and no woman with a fireplace poker could undo. On the kitchen bookshelf, the one that runs the whole length of the east wall, the one my great-grandmother filled with her books, and my grandmother added to, and my mother curated with the particular care she gave to everything she loved, there is a book. It's a library paperback, old enough to have that particular smell of age and repeated handling. My mother checked it out 6 months before she died and never returned it. I found it in a box in the study, one of the boxes Della hadn't gotten to. There is a dog-eared page near the back, page 247, a chapter about a woman who plants a garden in a difficult place and watches it take hold against expectations. My mother had pressed a dried sprig of something between those pages. I don't know what it is, Lavender maybe, or thyme. It has no scent left. But it is still there, still flattened between page 246 and 247, the way she left it. I leave the book there. I look at it sometimes, just the spine of it, when I'm making tea in the morning with the harbor light coming in across the kitchen floor. It is enough. It is, in fact, everything.